Bum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum.
Welcome to Everyday Musicality, the podcast in which we discuss all things related to Gordon's music learning theory and how it can help unlock the inner musician that lives inside of all of us. I'm your host, Heather Shouldice, music educator and faculty member for the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. In this episode, we focus on rhythm skills learned at the Aural level of the skill learning sequence. Hello and welcome to the Everyday Musicality podcast. Today we're continuing the mini-series of episodes focused on the first level of Gordon's skill learning sequence, Aural. In the last episode, I talked about tonal skills learned at the Aural level of the skill learning sequence, and today I'm going to talk about rhythm skills at the Aural level. If you're not familiar with the term Aural, I suggest you go back and listen to episode number 33, in which I give an overview of the Aural skill level. And for a big picture view of how the Aural level fits into the larger scheme of music learning theory, check out episode number 9, in which I give an overview of the skill learning sequence, which is the theoretical framework at the heart of MLT. I'll link to both of those episodes in the show notes. Before we get into today's topic, just a reminder that this podcast is sponsored by GIA Publications and the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. GIA is the publisher of my recent book, Weaving It All Together, a practical guide to applying Gordon's music learning theory in the elementary general music program. I'll link to that in the show notes in case you'd like to check it out. The Gordon Institute for Music Learning, commonly referred to as GIML, also has lots of exciting things going on, including a faculty hangout this Sunday, October 24th with Diane Lang, who will be chatting about combining Orff Schulwerk and MLT. That event is free for GIML members. I'll link to that in the show notes as well. There are lots of great events happening within the individual chapters of GIML also. On November 20th, Jennifer Bailey is giving a webinar sponsored by the New England chapter of GIML on teaching kindergarten music through an MLT lens. That event will be $10 for GIML members, $15 for non-members, and $5 for students. I'll link to that in the show notes, as well as the book that I co-authored with Jennifer and Jill Reese entitled Q&A for MLT, General Music Perspectives on Music Learning Theory. Now, let's get into rhythm skills learned at the Aural skill level. Remember that the point of the Aural skill level is to begin formal music instruction by having students develop their musical listening and performing vocabularies, and that at the Aural level, students are singing, chanting, moving, and playing instruments without music notation or solfege syllables, which come later in the skill learning sequence. When students are learning rhythmic content at the Aural level, the main skills they'll be developing in conjunction with that content include moving to macrobeats and microbeats and chanting them on neutral syllables, echoing rhythm patterns on neutral syllables, and recognizing familiar rhythm patterns within a song or chant. First, let's talk about moving to macrobeat and microbeat and chanting them on a neutral syllable. A sense of macrobeat, microbeat, and how those two beat levels fit together is important because this forms the basis for rhythmic context and thus our audiation of meter. The ability to audiate the macrobeat and microbeat in a given context provides a rhythmic framework on top of which we audiate rhythm patterns. Audiation of these beat levels gives us an internal metric engine that is always running in our audiation as we listen to or perform a piece of music. This enables us to have a more accurate sense of meter and tempo. We sing, chant, move, and play with better rhythm when we are audiating these simultaneous beat levels. Before expecting students to audiate and perform macrobeat or microbeat, it is helpful to provide them with opportunities to move with flow and to experience the beat in an informal manner first. This can be done through activities that emphasize cooperative movement to the beat in playful ways. I'll link in the show notes to episode number 15, in which I shared some practical ideas for informal guidance, including moving with flow and helping students feel the beat in an informal way. Being encouraged to feel the beat, along with the ability to move with continuous fluid movement, will provide students with the readiness to accurately chant and move to macrobeat and microbeat through formal instruction at the aural skill level. Next, I'll model a process for how you can teach the macrobeat and microbeat at the aural level using the song Stirring Our Brew, which is from Jump Right In, the General Music Series, Book 1. Ya-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. Stirring and stirring and stirring our brew. Ooh, ooh. Stirring and stirring and stirring our brew. Ooh, ooh. Tip, toe, tip, toe, tip, toe, boo. This time, let's move while I sing the song. Let's move to the little beats. They sound like this. Ba, 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 ba. Let's tap those little beats on our shoulders as you listen to me sing. Stirring and stirring and stirring our brew. Ooh, ooh. Stirring and stirring and stirring our brew. Ooh, ooh. Tip, toe, tip, toe, tip, toe, boo. Now let's move to the big beats of the song. They sound like this. Ch, ch, ch. Let's sway our body side to those big beats. Ch, ch. As you listen to me sing. Stirring and stirring and stirring our brew. Ooh, ooh. Stirring and stirring and stirring our brew. Ooh, ooh. Tip, toe, tip, toe, tip, toe, boo. So let's talk about this process a little bit. The tricky thing is that with a podcast, you can't see me. If you were able to see me, you would see me modeling those movements to the big beat and little beat. Remember that at the aural level, you should make sure you are modeling the skill before you ask students to perform the skill. If you simply said to them, move to the big beat while I sing the song, and didn't model it before you prompted them to move, you would be forcing them to make an inference. They would have to identify the macrobeat independently. At aural, students aren't independently identifying. They should be recognizing. So when I prompted you to move to the little beat or the big beat a moment ago, I made sure to model it for you, at least in sound. And if you were able to see me, I would also model the movement as I sang the song for you. There will be times in the future when you'll want students to independently identify the macrobeat or the microbeat, but aural is not that time. That will come in the inference levels of learning. We'll talk about bridging to inference learning from aural in the next episode. One quick note about labels. When I first start teaching the skills of moving to and chanting macrobeat and microbeat on neutral syllables at aural, I just call them big beats and little beats. You can certainly start with the labels macrobeat and microbeat right away, but personally I found that my students have an easier time remembering those labels once they can already audiate, move to, and chant those two beat levels. This lets them have the experience first and then attach the labels macrobeat and microbeat later on. Once my students seem to be audiating the two beat levels and can recognize big beat versus little beat, then I add in the name macrobeat for the big beat and microbeat for the little beat. To help the students remember those two labels, I like to use a few little tricks because anyone who's taught these terms before has probably had the experience where students get them mixed up, they get confused, they call them macaroni beats, and so sometimes we have to find some little tricks to help students remember the differences between the term macrobeat and microbeat. One thing I do is to use vocal inflection. When I'm first introducing the labels macrobeat and microbeat to my kindergarten students, for example, I use a lower voice when I introduce the term macrobeat and a higher voice when I introduce the term microbeat. So one day I might say to the students, we know that we can move to the big beats of music. A fancy way of talking about the big beats is to call them macro beats. Say macro beats. Macro beats. And macro beats are the big beats. What do we call the big beats? Macro beats. And then I would introduce the little beats can be called micro beats. What do we call the little beats? Micro beats. So just using a slightly lower voice for macrobeat and a slightly higher voice for microbeat. It seems silly, but it's just one more kind of an aural cue to help the students remember those two words, which can seem pretty foreign at first. Another thing I might do if students needed more help remembering macrobeat versus microbeat, just the terms, not necessarily feeling those, but just remembering which word goes with which kind of beat level, big or little, I might connect to their prior experiences and vocabulary just in life in general. So I might ask them, who's ever been to McDonald's before? Raise your hand if you've ever been to McDonald's. Well, at McDonald's, they sell a sandwich, a burger called a Big Mac. So you can remember Big Mac is like macro beats are the big beats. Big Mac, macro beats are the big beats. And raise your hand if you know what a microscope is. Yeah, in a microscope, you look into it to see things that are very, very tiny, very small things. So you can think of a microscope, you look in to see very little things. Microbeats are the little beats. So those are just some little tricks I might use to help students just remember the labels, macrobeat versus microbeat. If they're having trouble recognizing big versus little beats and understanding how to feel the difference between those beat levels, that's a different beast altogether. That's not just confusion about the label that we're attaching. That means students need more modeling and maybe more readiness to be able to recognize the difference between big and little beats. Now remember that using the terms macrobeat and microbeat is technically breaking one of the quote-unquote rules suggested by Gordon. Gordon said that labels should not be used until the verbal association skill level. However, you have to make your own decisions about how you will implement MLT in your teaching. Personally, I found it helpful for students to learn the terms macrobeat and microbeat before verbal association because there's so much other material students are introduced to at the verbal association level. They have to learn syllables and meter names, and I've found this to be a lot easier if students are already familiar with the concepts and labels of macrobeat and microbeat before they get to verbal association. So at the oral level, you would have students move to the macrobeat and microbeat with the repertoire they're learning, as well as chant those two beat levels on neutral syllables like we did a moment ago, where we chanted ba 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 for the microbeat, and we did ch ch for the macrobeat. In that case, ch would just be a different neutral syllable. You could also have students play the macrobeat or microbeat on an unpitched percussion instrument, like rhythm sticks or hand drums. Once students can audiate and perform the macrobeat and microbeat separately, experiencing them both simultaneously will strengthen their audiation of meter. The easiest way to start having students experience simultaneous macrobeat and microbeat is to split them into two groups, with each group performing one of the beat levels. So in the example from a moment ago, you could have half the class sway to and chant the macrobeat, ch, 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 while the other half of the class pats and chants the microbeats, ba 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 ba, and have each of those two groups performing their own beat level as you perform the song or chant. Then the two groups can switch parts. Next, if students are comfortable performing the two beat levels in two separate groups, you could try having them perform both parts simultaneously by moving to one while vocalizing the other. So in the example from a moment ago, you could have students sway to the macrobeat and chant the microbeat. So while their body is moving to ch, 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 their mouths would be saying ba 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 while you perform the song or chant. Then you could have them switch parts. The students would be vocalizing ch, ch, ch for the macrobeat, and they would be tapping the microbeat ba 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 ba. So moving to one while vocalizing the other. Finally, if students are able to move to one beat level while vocalizing the other, they're ready to start moving to both beat levels simultaneously. So in the example from earlier, they would be swaying their bodies to the macrobeat while tapping the microbeat. They can do this while you perform the song or chant, and eventually they can move to the macrobeat and microbeat simultaneously while they perform a song or chant. Just be aware that moving to two beat levels simultaneously is quite challenging, just from a coordination standpoint. So if students struggle, just keep practicing. So that's the basic way of introducing macrobeat and microbeat at the oral level. There are lots of playful ways in which you can reinforce and practice audiating, moving to, and chanting the macrobeat and microbeat. Here's where I would like to try something new on the podcast, a listener idea or listener suggestion episode. If you have a favorite way that you like to get your students feeling and performing the macrobeat or microbeat, maybe a fun activity or a prop that you like to use, please send me a brief description in an email or a voice memo, and I'll share it in an upcoming episode, giving you credit, of course. Let's look at the next rhythm skill that is practiced at the aural level, which is echoing rhythm patterns on neutral syllables. Back in episode number 8, I talked about the basics of pattern instruction, so I'll link to that in the show notes. Basically, the skill of chanting rhythm patterns is important because it helps students develop a rhythm content vocabulary. Just as young children build a vocabulary of words to use in communicating, a vocabulary of rhythm patterns serves as the musical building blocks to help students learn to audiate rhythmically and communicate their own musical thoughts. Then they can connect that pattern vocabulary to the repertoire they're learning, which is part of the whole-part-whole learning process in music learning theory. I talked about that whole-part-whole learning process back in episode 5, which I'll link to in the show notes. So teaching rhythm patterns can be pretty simple. If you're doing it in terms of the context of a song or chant, you would want to make sure that you're chanting your rhythm patterns in the same tempo and meter as that song or chant. So for example, if we were doing patterns with Stirring Our Brew, stirring, and that was our tempo. So then if we're going to teach rhythm patterns, ba 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 ba. Repeat after me. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. So notice that I started by establishing the meter. That's important because it helps prepare students to audiate the rhythmic context of the patterns we'll be performing. Now, if you're going to do the patterns immediately after a song or chant, that would have already established the context. But if you were going to do pattern instruction in an isolated manner, say during a learning sequence activity, you'd want to make sure that you start by establishing the meter. I didn't just start chanting patterns for you out of the blue because that would have forced you to identify the rhythmic context for yourself. So I chanted that short metric prep sequence. In this instance, our patterns were in triple meters, so for that prep sequence, I chanted ba 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 ba. And notice that I did that on neutral syllables because we're at the aural skill level. Later on, when we moved to the verbal association level, we could add rhythm syllables to that metric prep sequence. After I established meter, I asked you to repeat after me and performed short rhythm patterns in the given context. These patterns were 4 macrobeats long, and notice that unlike with tonal pattern instruction, which I talked about in the previous episode, I did not pause between rhythm patterns. This is because you want to keep the rhythmic context going in rhythm pattern instruction, like an engine. Now, you couldn't see me, but if you had, you would have seen me bring my hands out on or before beat 3 of each pattern I was performing, and then give you an upward gesture on beat 4 of my pattern to show you to breathe on beat 4 before you started echoing the pattern. Unlike tonal pattern instruction where we breathe with students when we show the gesture for them to respond, for rhythm patterns, we show the gesture on beat 4 of the pattern we're chanting, but we don't breathe with students. We just teach them that they should take a breath when they see your hands come up. This is because you may still be chanting on beat 4 of your pattern, but you want the students to take that nice solid audiation breath for a full macro beat before they start chanting. So if you had the pattern ba 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 ba, you would still be chanting for all of beat 4. So you would always just show that gesture on beat 4 to show students to breathe and then start chanting. Even if there's a pattern like ba 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 ba, where you're not chanting for the full duration of that 4th macro beat, you still wouldn't breathe with the students. You wouldn't try to sneak the breath in on one of those last macro beats of beat 4 because you want students to be in the habit of taking that full macro beat breath before they start chanting. There are learning sequence activity pages designed to focus on the skill of echoing rhythm patterns at the aural level, and after teaching a few group patterns, you'd move on to inviting students to echo rhythm patterns in solo. Once students have experienced echoing rhythm patterns in learning sequence activities, there are a variety of ways in which the skill of performing rhythm patterns on neutral syllables can be practiced through classroom activities. One simple way is to chant patterns for students to echo in between repetitions of a song or chant. Additionally, classroom activities can incorporate props or games to engage students and encourage chanting or playing of rhythm patterns. Again, I'm planning that future episode sharing listener suggestions, so please send me your favorite activity ideas for getting students to echo rhythm patterns, and I would love to feature your suggestion in a future episode. In addition to echoing rhythm patterns on neutral syllables, another important rhythm skill to develop at the aural level is recognizing where rhythm patterns happen within songs or chants. Again, this is an important component of the final whole within the whole part whole learning process, in which students apply their audiation skills and pattern vocabulary to their performance and understanding of repertoire. To teach the skill of aurally recognizing a familiar rhythm pattern within a song or chant, you might do something like this. Pumpkin patch, I'm looking for a pumpkin in a pumpkin patch. Here is one, nice and fat, turn into a jack-o'-lantern just like that. Be my echo, ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba. Now that pattern happens somewhere in my chant. Listen again and see if you can find where that pattern happens. Ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba. What was the pattern again? Ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba. Right, so remember that pattern. Ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba. Listen for that. Pumpkin patch, I'm looking for a pumpkin in a pumpkin patch. Here is one, nice and fat, turn into a jack-o'-lantern just like that. What was the pattern? Ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba. Did you find that pattern? Ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba in the chant? Here's the answer. I'm going to show you the answer by tapping with my hands. Anytime that pattern happens, here I go. Pumpkin patch, I'm looking for a pumpkin in a pumpkin patch. Here is one, nice and fat, turn into a jack-o'-lantern just like that. So the pattern, ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba, sounded like pumpkin patch. And it also came in later on, here is one, nice and fat, ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba. Cool, so that pattern happened 2 times in our chant. By the way, this chant is called Jack-o'-lantern, and it's also in Jump Right In Book 1. Notice that in the process I just modeled, I didn't ask you to tell me where the pattern happened in the chant independently. I did ask you to listen for the pattern, but then I was sure to tell you what the answer was. If you wanted to have students generalize and find the pattern independently, then you could ask students to tell you where the pattern happens, but just make sure that you are aware that that would be a level of inference learning. At Aural, we make sure to show students the answer and then ask them to recognize the answer. To show you where the pattern happened, I tapped it whenever it happened in the chant. Other ways of showing where the pattern happens might be to raise my hand whenever the pattern occurs in the song or chant, or move to the pattern in some way whenever it happens. Then you could ask the students to recognize where the pattern happens by doing that same movement or raising their hands when the pattern happens in the song or chant. Another idea for recognizing that rhythm pattern would be to have students chime in on the pattern whenever it happens as you perform the song or chant. So you would perform the chant in this instance with the chant Jack-o'-lantern, and then you would gesture for students to chime in by chanting that pattern ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba whenever it occurs in the song. So I would start right away by gesturing to you. Ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba. I'm looking for a pumpkin in a pumpkin patch. Ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba. Turn into a jack-o'-lantern just like that. You could also have students move a prop or play an instrument whenever the pattern happens in the chant. Maybe you tap the pattern with rhythm sticks whenever that rhythm pattern occurs. Once students are familiar with the pattern and where it happens, you could also invite individual students to chant it in solo whenever it occurs in the song or chant. So those are the main rhythm skills practiced and reinforced at the aural skill level: moving to macrobeats and microbeats and chanting them on neutral syllables, performing rhythm patterns on neutral syllables, and recognizing familiar rhythm patterns within a song or chant. I should also mention that these skills are always combined with content. So, for example, you might start with macrobeat, microbeat patterns that are only made up of combinations of macrobeats and microbeats in duple and triple meters at the aural level. But then later, you would decide how and when to add in other rhythmic content at the aural skill level. For example, once you've moved macrobeat and microbeat patterns in duple and triple along to the verbal association level, you might decide to start teaching division elongation patterns in duple and triple at the aural level. Later on, once you've moved along to symbolic association in duple and triple, you might choose to start teaching patterns in uneven paired meter at the aural level, and so on. When you're teaching at a particular skill level of the skill learning sequence, you're always combining that skill level with content, a particular tonality or meter, and particular functions of the patterns. So you get to decide how you're going to sequence that content and how you're going to move that content through the skill learning sequence at various times. Before I wrap up, don't forget to send me your favorite strategy for teaching macrobeat and microbeat or rhythm pattern echoing. Maybe it's a fun pattern echoing game or a prop that your students love that gets them excited to chant in solo or that provides a great visual or kinesthetic reinforcement of the beat. Whatever it is, we would love to hear about it. Just send a description to me via email at everydaymusicality@gmail.com, or you could record a short voice memo of yourself describing the activity and email me that voice memo. I'm sure listeners would love to hear other teachers describe in their own words what they have found success with. So please send me your emails or voice memos. In the meantime, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please get in touch. You can email me or send me a voice memo at everydaymusicality@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and let's keep musicking every day.